Well, I think we'll get started. We've got a great core audience that was here right on time. Welcome. I am Bobby Lauer. I am the new president of Campus Compact. I think it's still okay to say new. Today is 1 month in the role, and I want to thank everybody who's been so welcoming and wonderful as I orient myself with the organization and all of our partners and members. We're really happy to have you with us today. Not necessarily happy because this is the topic that we're going to be talking about and that these are the events that are unfolding, but thrilled that we're coming together as a coalition, as a community, to talk about what we can collectively do. We are all institutions and leaders and individuals committed to the public purposes of higher education. And that is very much at the core of who Compact is. And I think today is a great representation of the power in our community and coalition coming together when there is crisis abroad or domestically, and the power of civic engagement and bringing people together. I'm thrilled with the group that we have today, and I am so thankful in particular to Eric Hartman, who made this happen. Being new to Compact, when the events began unfolding weeks ago in Ukraine, and our team started talking about what can we do? We were hearing calls from members who were saying, how can we respond? How do we think about our work in higher education-based civic engagement? And Natalie on our team immediately knew who the right person was for us to reach out to, a longtime partner and colleague with Eric. So I'm going to let Eric introduce the phenomenal group of people that he has brought together and let him take it from here. But again, I want to say thank you and to let you know that this is also the first in a series of conversations and collective actions that Compact wants to take. We will be announcing likely in the coming days a second session that will really be elevating the voices of student leaders abroad and how they were thinking about bringing together students in Europe to activate and respond to the crisis. So before I do that, let me introduce who Eric is. If you don't know him, Eric is the executive director of the Haverford College Center for Peace and Global Citizenship. He is well-versed on everything global in nature when it interfaces with civic engagement. And I've actually asked Natalie, who just put it in the chat, to give you a sense of some of Eric's accomplishments. So you can click on that link. And with that, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Bobby and Natalie at Campus Compact for hosting us and for reaching out about what is happening in Ukraine and standing up for the defense of democracy, which is the question that kind of got this started. The Community-Based Global Learning Collaborative, which I'm on the executive council for, has always insisted on a global framing in relation to how we consider questions of justice, inclusion, and sustainability. Global in the framing, but also and deeply community-driven. And with that language, I'm calling attention to the questions of how the voices, knowledges, and insights of the people most affected by injustice are invited into conversation and epistemological understanding at the end of the day in higher education. Today, we are gathering as people situated in the US and thinking about how to advance US civic education and university engagement response. I say that because there's some things we're not going to do, we're not able to do. The University of Pittsburgh Graduate School of Public and International Affairs recently organized a strong panel on the security situation in Ukraine. That's important, but not what we're doing. There are really important civil society networks mobilizing voices of Ukrainian resistance and Russian voices for peace and resisting the current government there. Connecting around the world through global poetry network like Worlds Together, Worlds Apart. Some of those folks have campus identities. That is essential work and not precisely what we're doing today. We're talking about this crisis unleashed, a humanitarian crisis, but also political, economic, cultural crisis unleashed by Vladimir Putin's use of the Russian army to invade Ukraine, and how civic educators, staff, and faculty on US campuses are responding already. And along with the critical questions this moment presents us, we hold roles dedicated to public purposes on US campuses, not only for this immediate crisis, but over time in relation to things like global norms for human rights, democracy, and democratic governance. The three things I want to note before sharing a bit of my framing from the collaborative and my work, and then introducing the panelists who I'm so thrilled are here with us today. First, we as a community of campuses are already doing a great deal. When you registered for this event, Compact asked you to share resources, and many of you have shared resources. I've actually made a kind of open access Google Doc with some of those resources, which I'll drop in. You can take a look at them now and or add to them later. I've told Compact I will follow up with a blog post on the resources mobilized today and shared today as well. So things that are happening are in Philadelphia and in Buffalo, where large Ukrainian communities are, donating through the pathways suggested by the centers there, working with large organizations that vet different kind of giving opportunities, giving directly, organizing with and learning from the networks of Ukrainian academics and students. And also a lot of institutions are really enhancing their capacity to open their doors to Ukrainian international students, which is a great movement, great to see. And finally, digital humanities, cultural artifacts, people are working together who are based outside of Ukraine to help ensure the preservation of Ukrainian projects underway. So we're already doing a great deal. Thank you for that. We want to continue to add to that. The second thing I want to make clear, we invite chat. So we're looking forward to seeing themes and questions emerge. Our colleague, Sarah Stanlick, who is an assistant professor and director of the Great Problems Seminar at WPI, is moderating the chat for us today and will help us bring questions and comments into the room. We really encourage thoughts in chat as we go. And third, I think this is part of my framing. In civic education, we often talk about the different kinds of commitments enacted through direct service, project work, or social change. Right now, Ukrainians and Ukrainian refugees have immediate needs and therefore benefit from direct service and even appropriate and thoughtful charity. That's important. And we have linked to many relevant resources to give immediately and give well. That's what a number of campuses are doing now. In the work of supporting and expanding global human rights, we in higher education must be involved in shifting how we think about the world as a global community if we're going to make progress. So civic education must be global education and vice versa. We must see differently to believe and act differently. Seeing differently, for us, the collaborative has come to mean pushing to understand a civics of interdependence, this idea that national citizenship has a place, but is clearly limited in how it differentiates. Global citizenship is reasonably critiqued often for a kind of colonial assumption. We are interdependent, right? Our interdependence is inescapable. It's written into the fabric of life. How do we deal with that? We assume all people are sacred miracles, and I also mean that in a secular way. It's at the core of human rights thought. People are dignified miracles. It's not the citizen, but rather the human, maybe even all sentient beings and the ecology that supports them that is the appropriate locus of concern. That's the values-based assumption that informs human rights and robust democratic theory. Every life matters and matters with equal value. In this vein, we must be aware that we're educating not only the mind, but also the heart and the soul. Relationship and other affiliation are core requirements of democratic life. That comes back to how we think about our national environment as well. To think well about the world requires thinking beyond our bordered realities. This global crisis is a reminder that effective or relatively effective and stable societies and relatively effective and stable marketplaces are miracles. They're miracles of human achievement. They're always fragile. They're always in need of nurturance and repair. So again, in this moment, because the stability has been fractured, there's a need for direct service, action, charity relief. But the problem here requires excellent global and civic education, integrated not overzealously for any single ideology, other than that core civic commitment. We all matter, we are interdependent, we deserve one another's respect and attention. I do want to acknowledge that domestically, this matters in deep ways as well. I wrote a piece about that about 10 years ago. It's called No Values, No Democracy, the Essential Partisanship of a Civic Engagement Movement. I'm afraid that my language there and recommendations might not have been strong enough. It's difficult to disentangle Putin's power and use of the Russian army from the global rise of authoritarianism and white supremacy and the role of the US citizenry and parts of the US political leadership in authoritarianism and white supremacy. These are global phenomenon, and it's a global conversation about what values matter most and how we educate and encourage forward. So thinking democratically and globally in robust and values-centered ways is anything but normative. During the onset of the pandemic, the collaborative put together flipped classroom resources that faculty use in single class sessions or staff use for co-curricular preparation on related themes. And I think Sarah is going to share some of these. Like how are we interdependent, and how might cosmopolitical thinking help us grapple with that? And what does global citizenship have to do with local actions and community building? These efforts are about the moral and ethical commitments of robust cosmopolitical thinking or human rights thought. They lead to clear questions like, how do we enact these values? We don't have a state the way we have the United States of America. So we need to think differently about government and governance. If we're thinking beyond borders, it requires us to be attentive to institutions that facilitate global governance, and it requires our civic education to include concepts like governance. We have a toolkit page, for example, that profiles several successful movements for human rights that span borders while explaining global civil society. It asks, how is global citizenship enacted? How are these values advanced? And I think we have that page to share as well. I'm speaking here to the civic value and civic actions of soft power, global norms, and we're seeing that global normative pressure being applied through civil society and governments. The New York Times had an excellent piece contributed by 3 reporters on March 5th. It's called How the West Marshaled a Stunning Show of Unity Against Russia. And it demonstrates this impressive array of civil society, market, and government responses, restricting aircraft flights and commercial aircraft, restricting international banking systems, soccer and Olympic restrictions, divestment from oil operations, retreat from places of business. That's a lot of not precisely coordinated, but significant response. We're also seeing an attempt right now for many states market, what we're seeing is this attempt for states, market actors, and civil society to resist this kind of autocracy and imperialism in this case. And if the world is going to become a better place, we need to do more of it, more often, more equally, and more consistently. Higher education institutions are civil society organizations, and among my 3 co-panelists, 2 will be speaking to special roles that higher education institutions can and do play in advancing rights work. The panelists are themselves seeing differently, doing differently, and creating new kinds of campus community partnerships, and community-driven structural change efforts. Diya Abdo is a professor of English at Guilford College who founded Every Campus a Refuge in September of 2015, calling on every college and university in the world to partner with their local refugee resettlement agencies to house refugees on campus grounds and assist them in resettlement. Dr. Abdo will share next about this profound and needed reimagination of the physical spaces of campuses as places of welcoming and refuge. I need to note Professor Abdo has to leave us at about 5:15, so when we go to questions, we'll take first any questions directed toward her. Shelley Inglis is with us from University of Dayton, where she's Executive Director of the Human Rights Center and an accomplished practitioner of human rights law, working with the United Nations in the Balkans, Turkey, Croatia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. The UD Human Rights Center is committed to bridging the gap between theory and practice, between scholars and practitioners. Professor Inglis will offer her insights as a practitioner and scholar of human rights work, considering opportunities in and among what people in higher education teach and how we approach scholarship as they relate to the global movement for human rights, also bringing her perspectives and experience in the region. And finally, and I'm speaking in terms of how people will speak in order, Michael Shipler, who's Vice President for Strategy and Program Quality for Search for Common Ground, will close the session before we go to comments. Search for Common Ground is an international non-governmental organization that works to end violent conflict and build healthy, safe, and just societies. It's the largest such organization dedicated to peace building, with offices in over 30 countries and a media reach of roughly 40 million people. Mr. Shipler is an alumnus of Haverford College, where a historic Quaker affiliation brings a counter-normative bias toward peace and peacemaking. Those of you familiar with the collaborative know that we often concern ourselves with small, localized, community-based organizations. That's absolutely correct. We are concerned about people most affected, closest to the issues, nothing about us without us. When I had the opportunity to hear Mr. Shipler speak at an alumni event, I was struck by the intentionality of working with community-based and local organizations that is central to Search for Common Ground's approach, while also being deeply interested in and attentive to scale, broad scale. Mr. Shipler will share how Search for Common Ground advances peace building and peace nurturing, inclusive of community organizations. I'm grateful to be connected with such an incredible group of people and colleagues, and look forward to hearing from each of them. Diya, it's to you.
Thank you so much. And I think the last time we met, Eric, was at Haverford, and I was speaking about every campus a refuge. There, Guilford College is another Quaker institution. It's always such a joy to speak at Quaker schools. And I just want to thank you for this invitation and for Campus Compact as well. Sarah, thank you for dropping links. There is actually a Campus Compact podcast about every campus a refuge that I did with the former president. And if you can find that and drop that in the chat, that would be wonderful. So my name is Diya Abdo. As Eric said, I'm a professor at Guilford College. I was born and raised in Jordan to Palestinian refugee parents, and I'm an immigrant to this country. And in 2015, it was really sort of the escalating Syrian refugee crisis that took me off my traditional path as an English professor. And it consistently saddens me that our response to crises is often just that, right? Crisis motivated and episodic, because it seems to us that crises like this are episodic, but they're not, they're consistent. As a Palestinian, I know that the displacement of Palestinians is an ongoing issue and has been an issue for over 70 years. So for me, it has become really a mission over the last 7 years to transform on a systemic level that's also very community driven, how we both do higher education and refugee resettlement in this country in the form of what I'm calling resettlement campuses. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means. But I really do believe that, and it's kind of a play on a camp, and happy to talk to folks about that term, but it's an idea that has been evolving over the last few years on how campuses can engage very meaningfully in refugee resettlement in this country. And I think colleges and universities can absolutely transform the landscape of refugee resettlement in this country and be transformed in the process. So it's a process that's transformative for everybody, but especially higher education institutions and refugees and refugee resettlement. For those of you who know about refugee resettlement, you know that our refugee resettlement capacity has been decimated over the last few years for obvious reasons. Much of it has to do with the administration. A lot of refugee resettlement offices have closed or laid off their staff. Lower refugee admissions have damaged our community-based infrastructure because less refugees have been coming in. We have not sustained the infrastructure that was there to support that. And so when Afghanistan happened, it was a disaster meeting another disaster. We needed to rebuild very quickly to meet that moment and support the thousands of Afghan evacuees who are already here, 75,000 of them. And we need to support increased refugee admissions in the coming years so that we're not simply reacting to crises like this, right? That we're thinking of the long term with the goal of building an infrastructure that truly supports a leadership role for the United States in refugee admission and integration for decades to come. And so when the crisis in the Ukraine happened, that was yet another reminder that we are not playing that important role in refugee resettlement and refugee support and refugee integration that we should be playing as a resource-rich country. And then add to that, of course, the climate issue and climate refugees. This is really the moment to rethink on a deep and systemic level how we're approaching refugee resettlement and refugee support. But even before the decimation, for those of you who know, refugees, when they arrive in this country, they arrive with a very limited stipend. It's $1,000. They have to pay back their plane ticket. They arrive with no social security numbers, although they get them very quickly. And they have a very challenging time navigating the complex health and social services systems in this country. And finding appropriate housing upon arrival. So they're really set up for a very challenging experience from the get-go. And so in 2015, I was kind of distraught, thinking about my position at the institution and wondering what I could do to support Syrian refugees, when I heard Pope Francis call on every parish in Europe to host a refugee family after the death of Aylan Kurdi, the 3-year-old Syrian boy who drowned with his mother and brother. And it really struck me, first of all, that idea of radical hospitality that's germane to all faith traditions, but also what the Pope was doing was he was calling on small communities to take responsibility, right? He wasn't calling on necessarily countries. He was calling on communities to take responsibility for supporting refugees. And it occurred to me that colleges and universities are exactly like parishes. We're cities, even, with abundant resources, housing to cafeterias, to a labor force that's hungry to help, and that we could absolutely heed that call and engage our campuses in doing that work of hosting refugees on our campus and supporting them in their resettlement, and in the process enhancing our educational, research, and service missions. So Every Campus a Refuge was founded in 2015. Its mission is to partner, as Eric said, every college or university in this country with a local resettlement agency to co-sponsor newcomers coming into their local area. But the end goal is to really create a sustainable resettlement campus ecosystem around the country where newcomers, the campus, and the community are transformed. We started doing this work in 2015 at the flagship chapter, Guilford College. Since January of 2016, we have hosted 66 refugees. We're currently hosting 16 Afghan evacuees on our campus and supporting them in their resettlement. They'll be on our campus for a few months. ICAR has spread to other chapters around the country, state and private institutions, and we host families. So we're not hosting enrolled students. That's what makes ICAR unique, is that we're supporting the more vulnerable newcomers, the elderly, children, and everything in between. At Guilford College, where we started the initiative, we continue to develop and refine our best practices around this effort. So for example, next week, 10 students from Hamilton College are coming down for their alternate spring break to support us in the hosting of the 16 Afghan evacuees, and they'll be learning about refugee resettlement in Greensboro versus Utica, where they are, and hopefully bringing the effort back to their campus. Every Campus Refuge has incorporated into a 501c3. Perhaps Sarah can drop the link to our website. There you'll find a lot of information about the effort, our best practices, and benefits, what benefits there are in terms of joining the initiative. What a resettlement campus does, and what we're calling all campuses to do, is really contribute free temporary housing to empower newcomers to invest in their future when they arrive. Resettlement campuses also leverage their resources beyond housing. They provide access to anything from libraries to gyms to cafeteria. So for example, at the flagship chapter, we hosted an artist who was able to use our art supplies and then exhibited his work in our gallery. And that always blows my mind that campuses have everything, right? It's housing and an art department and a gallery where you can really sustain the thriving of newcomers and not just survival. Typically, families stay between 3 and 8 months, but they average 5 months, and they access facilities and amenities and utilities on campus. Most importantly, we really leverage the human resources on campus. We mobilize students, faculty, and staff who work together to foster a sense of belonging among hosted guests and in partnership with the resettlement agency. And we provide case management and wraparound services, as well as services that are unique to our campus culture. So in addition to airport welcome, we also provide EL tutoring, we assist with shopping, we provide transportation, we act as cultural brokers, etc. As I said, we've expanded and we really encourage campuses to take on this effort. Both state and private institutions are doing incredible work. So for example, Oklahoma State University is hosting 50, maybe 50 families. They're literally changing the demographics of Stillwater in Oklahoma by hosting that many Afghan evacuees. Think of the ways that we can change the landscape of this country in doing this work. And other campuses have recently joined in New York and in Virginia. We believe that campuses are really well suited to do this because there's 4,000 of us. So imagine if we all did this, what that would do to the resettlement landscape and to the civic engagement on our campuses. Several campuses actually continue to do this for years. So it's incredibly sustainable. And can create a sustainable infrastructure for refugee resettlement. We can support campuses in doing this because we have a best practices manual that you can access on our website, but we're also providing trainings and workshops. We also have impact studies that show that refugees hosted on a resettlement campus experience greater financial stability and a greater sense of belonging, and that students who participate experience increased knowledge about refugee issues and immigrant issues and are more likely to advocate for refugees and immigrants because of their participation in this really place-based community of support with real people rather than, focused on theoretical issues. The impact on higher education has, and we believe, is immense. It creates global citizens. It is, as I said, place-based. It aligns very well with campuses' efforts around diversity, equity, and inclusion, but it walks the walk rather than just talking the talk. It has allowed us to engage our alumni to recruit prospective students. And when I'm thinking about globalization, internationalization efforts, and also the goals of study abroad and the ways in which those are not equitably available to students, having something like this on a campus where students can engage in meaningful service learning with refugees really aligns with the goals of a sort of a study abroad at home. A lot of people ask me about what this costs their institution. Really, the cost is of a house. And if that house is available because it's sitting empty in between faculty or staff tenants, or if it's an apartment that's available because there isn't an RA living in it at the moment, it's really very minimal cost. At Guilford College, it costs us about $12,000 a year, but a lot of it is mobilized and raised through in-kind donations. You can also staff the effort through a student club or a graduate assistant. That's the model that's been happening across a lot of chapters. So there's a way to leverage a lot of the resources that you have to actually do this work and do it well. The other thing at Guilford that we did was we designed a minor where students can actually get credit for doing this work, but you don't have to have a minor, right? You can do this through a course where students get credit for volunteering. And there are ways to leverage whether it's a Bonner program or other programs on your campus or centers that offer service learning and community engagement to mobilize your students to do this work. I want to share my screen really quickly to show just my last 3 slides that give you a sense of what we're talking about when we mean transforming the landscape of refugee resettlement. And hopefully my map shows. Can you all see it? So this is the refugee resettlement agencies in this country today, right? These are how many colleges and universities there are here. Every resettlement agency represents a point of support, a point of housing support, a point of case management support, refugee support. This is how many there are of us in this country. And this is what the refugee resettlement landscape could look like if we mobilized, galvanized campuses as resettlement campuses. We can change what refugee resettlement looks like if we tap differently into our resources and support our communities in ways that are driven by their needs. I think, this hospitality and accountability, because I think institutions are accountable to this, our policies, our government's policies make us accountable, is transformative at all levels. I urge you to do this. I think what you need, if you want to do this, is find a couple of champions on your campus and get connected with the refugee resettlement agency. We actually have a map that helps you locate your resettlement agency. If Sarah can drop that it's on our website, it's called the PERC map. And you can plug in your university name and you'll find your refugee resettlement agency very easily. That's the title there. And here's our website and more information, but I'm happy to answer questions later, and I'll drop my email in the chat in case folks want to talk more. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you. And Shelley Inglis, you're ready.
Well, thanks, Eric, and thank you to Campus Compact for having me speak today. I have a slightly different sort of level of engagement and speech than Diya's, but I really am impressed, and I think that's great work that you are doing. It's very impressive, and I, do a shout out to you for your advocacy and for your concrete work in this regard. And obviously it links so concretely to Ukraine, as we have 4 million now Ukrainian refugees in the context of just over 2 weeks of conflict, which is an extraordinary amount of refugee movement, even in light of the very large refugee numbers we have from Afghanistan, as you mentioned, and from Syria, in addition to a number of other countries. But I wanted to first just talk a little bit about where I come from so that my comments can be put in the context of who I am. And I also want to encourage, I hope that we're going to have a lively conversation and debate and questions and provocations. So my background, as you heard a little bit in the bio, dates quite a long time back in the Balkans in particular, but also working in the region in which the Ukraine sits, so in the former Soviet Union region. But I did have explicit work in the Balkans stemming from a student exchange program that I took when I was a teenager, and lived in the former Yugoslavia, which was a country at one point, is that long ago. And that country disintegrated into a number of conflicts, and I worked in those conflicts. And so that experience is really looking at what's happening to Ukraine right now. It's very triggering for somebody like me, because it very much looks like and has a lot of similarities to what happened in the Bosnian War, in addition to other conflicts, a more recent conflicts, or in terms of conflicts within Russia, like the Chechnyan wars. So I come from that context and that personal lived experience with conflict and with working in conflict, and also having done that very young, graduating college and then going off to work in humanitarian assistance for Save the Children and a few other NGOs, having to sort of go to the conflict context directly in order to get a job. Because in my day and age, it was very, very difficult to get a job coming out of college in working in humanitarian assistance. And I tried, and I spoke the local language and still couldn't get a job out of Cornell. So I had to actually go to the war zone in order to get a job. And so I did that. Nowadays, universities have centers like the one that I lead that actually focus on preparing students to be able to work in this space in either humanitarian, human rights, global development, and giving them sort of practical tools and experiential learning, both overseas, but similar to what Diya is talking about, in local place-based ways, to be able to go into these areas of work that really didn't exist very much at my time, my university. So it was very much an experience of trying to figure out how to work in conflict. I think it's very hard to educate university students in the United States around conflict. And I think there are a number of things that this Ukraine crisis does for us in terms of giving us places to think about how are we educating our students around conflict. And it does it in a way that I think we've struggled a bit with Afghanistan and with Iraq and with Syria and some other places, with Yemen, to be able to discuss some of these challenges with our students. And so Ukraine provides, I think, an opportunity, which I hope educators are really going to embrace, to be able to bring some of the realities of what's happening globally to our students. And I say that recognizing that it isn't a good thing, the war in Ukraine, nor recognizing that maybe some of the, we could talk about the parallels and some of the challenges we've had around educating our students around conflict in other places. But I think there are things about the Ukraine in particular, which I can talk to as my experience, that I think are very important for us to be engaging students on. And the first is that a lot of the norms around conflict, or the norms that you were talking about, Eric, around global governance, in fact, a lot of the standards and the institutions that create the global society in which we organize the global society, right? We organize principally the global world through nation states, as you referenced, and nation states having the primary role to interact through norms, so through international law with each other, in order to solve problems, or in order to engage in trade or in economics, or in order to engage in any kind of meaningful interaction. It's all based on international law, an area where you can have law students, but even law students in the United States aren't required to take international law. It's very usually not very interesting subject for many law students, because it isn't on any bar exam. It's not a part of any educational requirement for any student in the United States. And then you have undergraduate students who might come across international law when they study something like human rights, which is what we teach at an undergraduate level through a major and a minor at the University of Dayton, which is unusual. We're one of the few that teaches it at undergraduate level. And there, students have to come to questions around international norms and international law, but there are a few students who do that. So this provides us an opportunity to take what is highly abstract for students in terms of thinking about how society is governed at the international level, and be able to place that in this context right now. Because what Russia has done very explicitly, as is obvious to us, but I'm going to mention it here, Russia has really invaded without any justification or provocation, in a very sort of aggressive and brutal way, a neighboring country in the European space, and a space in which the primary U.S. Foreign policy objective has been since World War II to create a peaceful democratic Europe, and also to contribute to the United Nations, which is the other, I think, global institutional framework that is very hard to teach students about, but they come to it. Only very few students ever think about it. They might engage with a model UN type of experience in high school or in university. But other than that, it's very hard to get students to interact with the global architecture in a meaningful way. And this invasion obviously demonstrates the limits of the global architecture. It's a very, very stark example of where the global architecture simply can't manage, has been established to actually take great powers and make them at the pinnacle of decision-making around international peace and security. And of course, one of those great powers has decided to basically invade another country. So it allows students, I think, to engage with that, with the limits of the United Nations, the limits of our global architecture, the failures or the weaknesses that we have, and also to engage in the fact that the extent of our global architecture, its strength stems from its most powerful states, and the extent to which its most powerful states, including all students within the United States, live in one of the 5 most powerful states, looking at it from the perspective of the UN, that we allow it to have, and see what some of its limitations are in terms of the ability of institutions to manage global power. I think that's one thing. I think the next thing is, obviously, you were talking about students and everybody wanting to contribute to humanitarian assistance. I think it provides an opportunity, and I do think it's important that students step back. There is obviously a massive humanitarian challenge in Ukraine. But we also have, ways in which to think about other dimensions of responding to the crisis. Refugees are one, and humanitarian assistance is another. But there are other ways that we should think about how do we build the tools of students to be able to respond so that they have sort of reflections on what do they do in their lives that aren't just the direct response when, as we were talking about, sort of crisis hits, crisis response. All of a sudden, I need to, care about or find the place where I can support a refugee, or I can send my money to a good charity. We want to move away from that kind of reactiveness in our society. And this provides us an opportunity, and I'm sure Michael is going to say a lot about how we think of methodologies that we can create in students that they can use outside of a crisis response. Some of those great methodology we focus on at the University of Dayton in our Human Rights Center, one of them is really peace building. And I'm sure Michael's going to spend a lot of time talking about that. But peace building and peace building dialogue and training students how to engage in peace building and dialogue is, I think, one of the key. And by this, I don't mean, macro level peace negotiations between states and international peace agreements. I'm really talking about how they can use tools of dialogue and tools of peacemaking amongst themselves, in their groups, in their communities, and with people that they don't know. And so we focus a lot on dialogue as a key peace building tool. But there are other things that students can do. And advocacy is one that we really focus on, getting students to be involved in. There are many democracy movements around the world right now. As we know, the rise of authoritarianism, which is sort of exploded in our face with this particular aggression of Putin on Ukraine. This has been going on for a while, but there have been responses in the people power space, in democracy movements all around the world, and some of them very, very clearly linked to this particular crisis. So the Belarus democracy movement putting a lot of pressure on Russia, the Russian democracy movement, democracy movements or women's rights movements in some of the former Soviet republics, as well as around the world. And there's a lot students can do to learn about these movements, the techniques of these movements, to support them using social media, using awareness raising, advocacy with legislatures as they consider how to react to democracy movements. And as you said, Eric, there's a large amount of sort of slightly coordinated mass movement in response to Russia that looks similar in some ways. We haven't seen it in a very long time, but to the sort of global campaign that existed in response to apartheid in South Africa, in a real effort to move and in sort of work globally to move the agenda, which was a terrible agenda of a particular country, using all the tools, the economic, the cultural, the political, and the social. So students can really get involved as they learn to, navigate these spaces. And I think it's really important that we do mention raising and teaching students about navigating the social media and the mis and disinformation space. That's another issue that's really emerging with this particular conflict, because the United States information system, the European one, is such a focus here between the sort of Russian space and ours. And also, frankly, as we all know, there has been a considerable amount of Russian engagement in our social media space and in creating mis and disinformation, including around our elections. So that's another, I think, space in when we're teaching students or engaging students in advocacy and having them be a part of movements, using a lot of technology now, not sitting down and writing the traditional letter, that we also engage with them on this question of mis and disinformation and how to figure out and verify the kind of groups they're supporting and information they're sharing. And I think a final space to talk about in terms of educating students, so allowing them the opportunity to see sort of macro level questions. Some of those questions, as I said, we haven't dealt with for quite a long time. So questions of nuclear power, for example, an issue that has really receded in terms of the consciousness of a country like the United States and receded in the consciousness of our students. This provides a sort of opportunity to remind students around that, the campaigns of, again, my generation, to remind students that is really the global guardrails, and we are closer to a nuclear confrontation than we have been in decades. So I just want to sort of wrap up with other ways that we can engage students in learning. And I want to advocate that, we continue the conversations so that we can, exchange good practices and be able to look at what various campuses are doing. We are doing, obviously, at Teach-In at UD. We use that tool often to be able to grasp the moment and extend to students across the university. Again, students who might not be taking the human rights courses, the international institutions and norms courses. So we use that as a tool to reach everyone. There is, as we said, dimensions of this conflict, or as I said, dimensions of this conflict that stretch across multiple disciplines, really across a university setting. You can look at dimensions of this conflict from many different perspectives, including, the impact this is having on climate change and the impact this is having on the rest of the world, both the economic sanctions and what it means, and the war itself, the disruption to food security for a number of countries in the global South. So there are ways to get at dimensions of this conflict from multiple perspectives. I do think, and I'll end here because I'm sure I've gone over, I do think it's really important to be thinking about this from the decolonial perspective as well. A lot of the TV coverage and a lot of the obsession with this, and I understand it, and that's why I started my conversation by, emphasizing that this is a part of the world I know well, that I very much, have association and relationships with, have a long history and lived experience with. But a lot of the media and a lot of the approach has really emphasized this European conflict, American-European Russian conflict, and is leaving out the rest of the world, and also highlighting there's a lot of bias in the media. There's been a lot of questions about the receptivity of certain countries to African or other refugees coming from Ukraine. So there's an exceptionally important, a way we need to zoom out and think about what this conflict looks like more globally, and who and how does this conflict impact others. And I think that's where, we can look at some of the African countries, their statements, their positions. I'm not just talking about China and India, which is often the conversation, but really looking at what is the impact and how is this conflict being perceived. I'll end with, I don't know if people have looked at what happened in the Security Council or been watching how the United Nations General Assembly and the speeches, but there is a tremendous amount for educators, really good content there, from African nations, from other nations, Asian nations, from small states, about their perspective on this conflict and how they see this conflict as a core challenge to their own survival, even for those, as the Kenyan ambassador to the United Nations did an extraordinary speech. I don't know if you all heard it at the Security Council, even for those countries who have been given their borders, who were colonized, but have decided that they will engage in this international system, and for whom this kind of clear violation of the core tenets or principles, as we say, of international relations and international humanitarian law, how challenging that is to their perception of their future. So I'll leave it there. I know that was wide-ranging and less specific than every campus a refuge, but hope it was useful.
Thank you. And Michael Shipler, thank you so much, Shelley.
Great, thank you all so much. It feels a little unfair to have to go after the three of you and to bring something additional to the conversation. Really, the work that you're all doing in this moment is so critical and crucial. It's a moment that demands the best of all of us. And so thank you so much to Campus Connect and to you, Eric, for this invitation. I work for an organization called Search for Common Ground. Like Shelley, I've been working in conflict areas around the world in partnership with people living with conflict to look at and identify ways to build peace in their societies. Our organization is 40 years old. I think even this month is our 40th anniversary. We're 1,000 people on our staff working in 30 countries around the world with over 800 partner organizations, from community-based organizations to multinational businesses to a whole government agencies to militaries and security agencies, a whole cross-section of institutions that really understand that they have a critical role in building peace in their societies. Of that 1,000 people, almost all of them are from the places that we work. We're in some of the most complex conflicts in the world. We've been able to stay in places such as Yemen. We're still have an office in Afghanistan, in Myanmar, despite the huge upheaval there, working in Democratic Republic of Congo, Central African Republic, etc. We've also recently established an office here in the United States. The conditions that led to war in Syria, that led to war in many other places, are present here. And as we focus on what's happening in Ukraine, we also have to recognize the polarization and divisions that we're experiencing here and the threats to democracy that we're experiencing here as well. We take an approach to our work. We call it the common ground approach. Everything that we do is fundamentally about bringing people, groups, institutions together from across dividing lines to collaborate around their shared interests. And we do that by trying to transform norms. So, develop norms in society that drive behaviors of people to be able to work collaboratively to cross dividing lines, transform institutions so that the institutions are also incentivized to work collaboratively, and then to transform markets to really look at how do you resource peace instead of resourcing violence. Everywhere we're working, we really seek to recognize the power and the agency of people in the face of enormous forces, which seem, large and very much out of the control or even out of the realm of possibility of influence of ordinary people. And yet we find that it's really ordinary people who are actually shaping and transforming the dynamics that are surrounding them and bring the most possibility and potential for peace. Let me give an example. This is an old example, but it's a story I love because it just really illustrates what it is I'm talking about. So we have had a long time presence in Sierra Leone, which is in West Africa. It's a country that had a very brutal and devastating civil war that caused enormous damage to civilian lives, huge refugee flows. And when the war ended, there were tens of thousands, maybe 30 or 40,000 soldiers, both on the side of the RUF, which was the non-state armed actor who had fought against the government, and in the government military. And, this included over 10,000 children. and when I say children, I'm talking 10, 11-year-olds, and, their children fighting in the war in Ukraine, their children in every armed conflict were armed and playing a major role. And so, all of these people who had been involved and associated were having to come home. And there were two men in Eastern Sierra Leone, one by the name of Rashad, another by the name of Fode. They were commanders for opposing forces. Rashad was the commander for the RUF, the Revolutionary United Forces. Fode for a pro-government militia, covering the city of Bo, in case you happen to know it. They agreed, looking at this scenario, that they had a clear and particular role to play in helping people put down their guns and come home. And so they agreed to co-host a radio show called Throw Away the Gun, where day after day, or week after week probably, they would get on the radio together and speak about how people could access resources, how communities could help ex-soldiers and ex-fighters come home. This show became hugely popular. Soldiers would listen to it and they said, wow, if Commander Fode and Commander Rashad are on the radio together, maybe the war really is over. Maybe I can put my gun down. I had dinner with these two guys a few years ago. And Commander Rashad, he looked at me, he said, Michael, this guy, he put his hand on Fode. He said, this guy, he tortured me once. And they roared with laughter. And there were a couple of us that kind of laughed uncomfortably. And Fode says, Rashad, you invaded my city. What was I supposed to do? And what I tell that story is because the work that we're talking about, the potential that conflict has to bring about profound transformation is immense. And my experience with this is that people who go through transformations like that actually experience profound elevation of their whole lives. It even causes almost a form of elation, a sense of purpose that emerged among them and all the others that they worked with around their country, and the tens of thousands of people with whom we were working day to day, who are in hugely divided societies that are being ripped apart by violence, who are steadily, person by person, stitching together relationships that are collaborative, that are really seeking to be transformative of their societies. And, I tell that story because, as we're in this moment, watching this invasion of Ukraine, I think all of us are feeling quite overwhelmed and we all feel really small. I think that people in positions of enormous power in the world are feeling quite small in the face of what's happening and are trying to say, like, well, what can I do? Who am I? What power do I have? I think that it's really important for us to really confront that and to really think about what power we do have. It's not easy, and I'm also feeling small in the face of all of these things, even if I'm in an organization like the one I'm in. So I have kind of three things that I wanted to talk about in relation to that. How do we feel big in a world where, where we're all feeling so small, confronting such forces that are around us? So first, right now right now the logic of war is everywhere. There's very little conversation or space for conversation about negotiations of peace or trying to find common ground across dividing lines as we're looking at this and responding to this conflict. And yet, to me, what we need to be doing and is to be challenging the logic of war with imagination. Now, when I say that, I don't mean a pacifist perspective. And I do know that there are people who are out there saying, well, actually, a nonviolent resistance to the invasion of Russia would be less devastating and maybe more effective. And there are people out there who are saying that. I don't know. I don't have a position on that. What I mean by saying that we need to challenge the logic of war with imagination is that we need to hold on to the possibility that peaceful outcomes could emerge out of the crisis that we're in. And we need to be looking for what those are. And that starts, of course, with stopping hostilities. It's very hard to actually create any kind of an environment where you have a discussion or negotiations with anybody when such vicious levels of violence are happening. And that's true. But we need to be imagining what's after it. We need to be already thinking about how we actually can restitch, the social fabric within Ukraine, the relationship between Ukrainians and Russians, the Western, so-called Western and Russian relationships, etc. We don't need to look farther than the miracle of the European Union to know that this is possible. Germany and France and, the United Kingdom are presenting a united front today, in opposition to Russia. And it's only a generation or 2 generations ago when one of the most brutal wars in the history of humanity was fought among those actors. So, it's not beyond the realm of possibility that 60 years from now, Russia and Ukraine and Germany and France will have a united front around something. We need to hold that. I shared, I think with you, Sarah, a link to a panel discussion of a group of youth leaders in Ukraine. This is about 2 weeks ago. There's been a follow-up that we hosted along with a few other groups to really create platforms for young activists who are responding, not just with weapons, because everywhere in the media and the milieu we're hearing about the armed resistance. And this was about young people responding with all the other tools that young people have. Already, they were talking about the different elements of what it's going to take to bring about peace, about accountability, about justice, about reconciliation, about preserving historical memory, about restitching their societies. As they were literally running from shelling and trying to do these meetings or recording messages to be part of this international community. The second thing I want to talk about is about world order. And, Shelley, I think you started to kind of allude to this a little bit. I think it's pretty evident to a lot of people, and people are saying this everywhere, that, that the post-World War II world order is in a state of collapse. It was designed to prevent this sort of war. Over the last 15 or 20 years, it's becoming less and less effective. It did sustain a level of international peace, I suppose, although, it's hard for anybody to say that to somebody in Syria or Somalia or Iraq. But it is really now not serving its purpose. And so I think we're facing a moment where we're going to be creating a new world order. This isn't unusual. In human history, world orders come and they collapse and new world orders emerge. Almost every time in human history, it's emerged out of a cataclysmic conflict, and the last was out of World War II. And I think the question that we need to be asking ourselves is, how do we create the post-World War III world order without going through World War III, right? What is it that we need to do to leapfrog that absolute cataclysmic collapse of society? Partly because World War III, I don't know that there is a real post-World War III world, right? But also, even if it's a conventional World War III, the destruction that we can cause to each other would be so devastating. As part of that, I think it's really important to understand that the next world order can't be created just by states and by traditional horizontal, vertical institutional power. And so I would come back to this question about young people and youth leaders and youth movements. The last number of years, we've seen an unprecedented level of youth action and youth activism, youth movements in Iraq and Lebanon, in Jordan, youth movements in Ethiopia, and all over the world, young people actually rejecting the future that's been laid out for them by the elders who's holding traditional institutional power. Young people are networked. And we actually have now an institutional legal structure that really lays a pathway forward for youth participation in peace building and security. It's the UN Security Council Resolution 2250, which was developed, with a whole group of young activists all over the world who came together and said, we demand a role. Our elders are not necessarily building peace in our societies and creating the security that we want. We're the ones being asked to fight. We should be the ones playing a major role in building peace. We're the present, not the future. And there's a whole structure now, a whole network, a whole universe of young people who are working on this, who are interacting with people carrying institutional power, looking at how you can bring about those powerful shifts in the norms of power and the norms of decision-making, the norms of resource management. You can tap into this, and I think your students can tap into this as well. There's a U.S. coalition on youth, peace, and security that's working across partisan lines here to get a youth, peace, and security law passed in the United States based on 2250. And there are national action plans emerging by governments all over the world, but really being led by young people. So how do we plug them in? And I think the third thing is maybe it's a little harder to justify in this world, but I don't want to say it anyway. It's around sustaining connections across dividing lines. You know, a few of you have pointed to different ways that people are seeking to sustain connections, and somebody mentioned a poetry network, and you know, how do we create and build networks that bring people together around their shared interests and empower people to create their broader political environment? And this is, you know, to me, this is really an important thing right now as we're watching Russia get more and more isolated. You know, the isolation of Russia is, you know, and the sanctions, and you know, I'm not going to comment on the wisdom or folly of that. And there's all this commentary on it. What we do know is that Russians are being more and more isolated. And yet there are a lot of people in Russia who are deeply interested in being globally connected and advancing very progressive values in our world. How do we connect them with each other? Virtual exchange is a really powerful tool, and it's a tool that Search for Common Ground has used in partnership with our sister organization, Solia. Maybe some of you have been involved in it. It's a virtual exchange, brings people together in the virtual space where people can't, you know, not everybody can afford to go spend their semester in London. But the virtual exchange programs that we've been focusing on have been really focused on building relationships across dividing lines. So bringing young people, you know, initially it was really from predominantly Muslim societies together with universities in the United States. But it's grown quite a lot. And, you know, the evidence has shown that people who go through even 40 hours of virtual exchange show increased levels of empathy, knowledge of global affairs, willingness to cross dividing lines, promote positive relationships, fight stereotypes, and take action in their communities. We've now brought this to the US because a lot of our campuses are highly divided and polarized environments, and running a program called First Year Connect, which is focused on preparing incoming first-year students to be able to cross dividing lines in the same way, using the same methodology, because it works so well. What that kind of thing really can do is it makes violence an unpalatable political choice. And in the world of, you know, where the logic of war is so prevalent and poignant and celebrated, building relationships is really one of the key tools that we can use to start to tone that down and force those who hold institutional power to use their imaginations to find other pathways and other solutions. I have lots more to share, but if I kind of had my final message here is, you know, is plug in, and is really like enabling young people to find access to this huge universe, particularly of youth activists who are out there in the world, who are in the middle of some of the harshest, most violent, divided societies, and who are crossing those lines with great courage and trying to make a difference, and are looking for allies and partners, and building out actually the next generation of norms for our world. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Michael. I just want to say humongous thank you to all three of you that were amazing content, so complimentary of one another. And I'm going to be quiet because I think Sarah has been watching questions and going to facilitate for us.
Absolutely. So I have been, and I have two that have been answered in text, but I think that it's still worth kind of raising them here. And I'll raise this first one before Dr. Abdo has to go. And folks are wondering about ways that if you don't have a lot of real estate and if you don't have housing to offer on campus, but you possibly are in a city, what are ways you can still be part of every campus a refuge?
It's a really great question. So I think one of the first things is to really try to understand from the folks who oversee real estate on your campus what real estate is actually available. You'd be surprised at what things exist on a college campus that you didn't know existed. Almost every campus I talk to, that's the first thing that they say is, we don't have, we're over enrolled, we don't, and then they realize, oh, there's that house that's been sitting there and nobody's using it. Could be a faculty house, it could be a staff house. So I would first of all investigate. But beyond that, if you, and also to say that college universities own a lot of housing that might be campus adjacent. So they might have property that's been left to them by board members, by trustees, by alums, by donors. It's worth asking questions about what is actually there and what's not there. But another thing to do would be to, as a collective, potentially as a club, a student club or a group, to fundraise to to rent a house that's close to campus. So I know that the Lafayette College chapter actually did that. Wake Forest chapter, the college owns a house that's adjacent to campus. So it's a little bit off campus, but not that far off that students, volunteers can't walk to it. There are lots of ways to leverage your resources. So housing is not don't stop doing this if you don't have housing, but housing is such a key piece because there is such a housing crisis, especially for newcomers. And so if you're able to support with that, that would be ideal. And for folks who have other questions, please feel free to email me and I'm happy to answer all of them as well about the housing piece.
Thank you so much. Did any of our other panelists have experience with the refugee resettlement opportunities and maybe the ways your campuses or organizations have partnered?
So we are partnering with our law school to provide support for refugees and asylees to do status adjustment, which is often, they don't get that support. They get resettled and some initial support. For us in Dayton, it's Catholic Social Services. That's the primary refugee resettlement agency. But then they don't have access to sort of the very basic legal services. And this is really basic stuff in terms of legal services, although they can be complex cases. So you have to have, the knowledge and the red flags, and you do need at least an attorney to supervise, but you can train students and law students in appropriate contexts to really help with these status adjustments without actually having refugees sort of stay on campus. Although, it's amazing what's being done with every campus or refuge. But I think there are multiple ways to support refugee resettlement in the community that might not involve residential housing.
Yeah. Right. I might ask one question a little off script to Diya before you head out. What about maybe some reluctance on the behalf of maybe the administration, of folks who want to engage in this work? What are your persuasive messages?
One of the things that's really been successful across campuses is to really understand the strategic plan that maybe your institution is going through and try to align this, which I think cuts across so much in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, in terms of civic engagement, in terms of service learning, in terms of globalization, internationalization, and to try to frame this work within that larger goal that your institution has. And I think some of the reluctance is ideological, it is political. We have seen a great interest in supporting Afghan evacuees and Ukrainian refugees because we perceive those as, more as allies. We've seen how over the years, different refugees are framed differently. This is the right moment to ask, because we've seen how administrators, how states, how governors have supported allies from Afghanistan and are now supporting Ukrainian refugees. So I think it's really understanding your administration's goals for the institution and trying to frame the effort within those goals. And I think it can fit very beautifully because it is transformative for students, for their engagement, and for the institution's and our stated values, quite frankly. We always say we're about community, we're about equity, we're about inclusion, we're about support. And so this can really fit into those strategic plans. Russell Sage, that became an ECAR chapter, they very strategically put it into the strategic plan and said, we'd like to implement this, and it was approved. And so I think thinking about a proposal that aligns with your administration's goals for the institution could be really strategic.
Absolutely. All right, that's wonderful advice. And you also started to speak to, and I'll open this up to everybody, this question of there was a question about how Ukrainian refugees are seen as different from Afghan refugees, Syrian refugees, and some of that disparity. So given that we know that people are being accepted and not accepted in different ways, how would you all talk about remedying that? Start with our students, our communities. What have you seen?
So, I think that the big issue really is the intersection with our own refugee and migration framework in the United States, and how politicized migration has become, and particularly looking at our border. Europe has had a very negative nationalist, populist response to the Syrian and Afghan refugee crisis that happened in 2015. The United States has had a very negative populist, nationalist response to our own border refugee crisis, where a lot of the people who are coming are perceived to not be refugees, to be migrants. So I think there's a lot of work to do in terms of educating our own population around the rights of those coming to the United States through our border to have refugee status determination. And that has been completely debilitated. So in the United States, people think of refugees as those coming from specific African countries or Ukraine and sometimes in Afghanistan, but they do not equate what we do in our migration and refugee system in terms of the border with the entitlement, the international human right to seek asylum. So I think there's a lot of education and reframing that has to be done in terms of our conversation around refugees in the United States, which is less about comparing, a refugee from Rwanda or the DRC to a Ukrainian, and much more about how do we treat those who are closest to us in terms of who are from neighboring countries who are seeking asylum in the United States.
I'm wondering too, Eric, if this is a question for you about that aspect of interdependence and how you're building that framework and that way of being within your students, either through the toolkit or other campus community partnerships.
Thank you. I was thinking about the two questions together. The last one about if you don't have a housing infrastructure that you want to be supportive, and also this question about the racism and the inequities built into the way that the media are treating this current crisis in relation to other crises, and the legal frameworks around acceptance. So in any case, I think one of the things, and Dr. Stanlick may have comments on this as well, because I know your work in Bethlehem and now in Massachusetts also intersects with local immigrant refugee inclusion, but working regularly and continuously with, in our case, Highest Pennsylvania in the Philadelphia area, and with New Sanctuary Movement, puts us into ongoing every summer, every semester, internships and courses and political events where we're doing things with students and partners that are, for instance, talking through driver license opportunity campaigns, which is an issue for us here in Pennsylvania in a particular way, of course. It really takes these global challenges and nests them in specific jurisdictional questions, but also puts people into relationship. And so in this current moment, our ongoing partner, Highest Pennsylvania, has said, yes, we hear a lot of concern around Ukraine, and everything they're messaging continuously says, this is one of three crises of resettlement we're working right now. The other two we're working are Afghanistan and Haiti, and continues to deepen that. So that's a kind of partnership and relationship, and then surrounding that with the educational resources that ask people to continuously look back. And I think it all returns to this critical question of how we encourage people to think seriously about what it means that every human being matters, right? And coming back to that again and again to address the hypocrisies that are built into the world we've inherited, right? To say it one way.
Yeah, and I really appreciated Shelley's point earlier too about rethinking the way in which proactively or reactively we think about the way that we can support in community, right? Because when big things happen, the gut feeling is, I want to be the superhero, I want to do this thing, or I want to do the thing that seems most legible in my mind. But some of those really behind the scenes, not glamorous pieces of being, welcoming someone into your community, accompanying them, just sitting alongside at a doctor's appointment, doing the ID registration pieces. All of that stuff isn't flashy, but it's so necessary, so welcoming, and so deeply personal. I don't know that students always have an appreciation for that. So building those habits of mind and those kind of, opportunities for them in campus community partnerships, or, being the wraparound services Diya talked about earlier, can be transformative for the students and for our communities. So, all right, I'm not seeing any other questions. So Eric, I don't know if I should turn it back over to you or Bobby.
I think we're right about the time where Bobby said she would drop back in, actually. And I just, Sarah, thank you so much for watching the chat and bringing the questions, and also Michael and Shelley once more. Great combination, you all.
Yes, well, I want to start doing naturally what we should do, but is so well-deserved, is just a huge thank you to Eric, Michael, Shelley, Sarah, Diya, who's already left us, for such a phenomenal conversation. I was writing down tons of comments, like I know everybody was, but I also appreciated, Eric, your point that so many of you really built on one another, but offered such different perspectives on how we're unpacking this as higher education leaders, and what this means, not for the short term, but for the long haul, and how we think about this moment and how it shifts and can change more systemic ways that we think about civic engagement in our work and in our practice. I did want to raise that I think something that's really powerful, that for me at least, during this conversation that it raised, is the opportunity to think about community engagement partners too in different ways. Particularly when we think about various resettlement organizations, if our partners in our universities are not currently working with them, this is a moment to rethink, what does your relationship look like? How can we think about partnerships? How can we think about readjusting and thinking about where we lean in for the long term? Because we also know this is a moment as we come out of the pandemic, that a lot of work in community engagement is in a moment of re-energizing, reflecting, reimagining what we're going to be doing holistically. So this crisis is also coming at a time where institutions and leaders are already deep kind of in that work. And I think today's conversations and points really point us in a direction that everyone should really deeply consider. There was lots of information, Sarah, that you shared in the chat. So we're going to make sure we export that entire chat, and we will integrate that into the blog post that Eric already mentioned that he's committed to doing. He also shared a Google Doc that has so many wonderful resources, and we want to say thank you to everyone who submitted them. We know in these kinds of webinars, a lot of people are wanting that recording, so we're going to be sharing that with everyone, and we are excited to see how the resources go. We'll also make sure we share contact information. So we appreciate all of you being so willing and open with your time. So thank you so much again, and we look forward to continuing to see where Compact can play a value-added role in helping our community come together right now.